guys. So, this is another installment of Life Magazine's The Most Notorious Scandals in American History. And we are still in the financial section. Financial scandals. Oops. So, today we will be reading about the savings and loan fiasco. I think we've hit the jackpot, Ronald Reagan said as he signed the 1982 Garn-St. Germain Act. Reagan was promising to ease government restrictions on businesses. Garn-St. Germain did just that. It lifted regulations on the savings and loan industry, a backwater of the banking sector primarily concerned with making home loans. Once confined to making safe, conservative investments, the S&Ls were now free to partake in high-risk, high-reward financial games. With the federal government's guaranteeing backing bank deposits for up to $100,000, it seemed like a no-one-could-lose situation. A new breed of high roller suddenly washed into the S&L industry. Under its leadership, stodgy banks were suddenly pumping money into risky real estate, casino, and oil ventures. Executives made multi-million-dollar loans to each other while regulators willingly turned a blind eye. Charles H. Keating Jr., the new owner of Irvine, California's Lincoln Savings and Loan, became the poster boy for the crowd. The former All-American swimmer and World War II pilot shifted Lincoln into a series of high-risk investments that produced enormous rewards. Keating took a huge chunk of the profits for himself. He hired family members at exorbitant salaries and steered money into campaign contributions for influential legislatures. Keating was not alone. Other S&L speculators funneled their windfalls into yachts, private jets, vacation homes, and political capital. Their sudden wealth represented laissez-faire capitalism at its best. The problem, of course, was that these capitalists were risking other people's money. The system was teetering by 1984 as S&L started collapsing under the weight of bad investments. A few within the Reagan administration recognized the looming disaster, but were too weak to defy the anti-regulatory this was during the 2008 crash. At the end of I guess I'm not really sure when it started. If it was like mid 2006 or exactly when it was a mainstream news story, but it was in the second term of George W. Bush's presidency, and basically all of the banks needed a bailout. There was a major bailout required, and I don't remember the exact amount, but taxpayers needed to pay however many $1 billion to bail these guys out. It was actually a very similar situation to this SNL scandal because you had regulations that had been carefully manipulated and carefully played around with through legalese in the previous years. Actually, that happened during Clinton's presidency. It wasn't even during George W. Bush's presidency. It was in the previous presidency that a lot of these laws, these regulatory financial laws for housing loans specifically, as well as other kinds of loans, but they had become very lax, allowing for people to buy houses more easily, and these were people who did not necessarily have the appropriate credit to buy that, amount of to get a loan like that. Basically, the loan was for what might be considered luxury homes, and then these people wouldn't have normally qualified. And so, what the law, I guess, was proposed to do was to make it easier for people, regular people. Like, that's how it was promoted, that middle class people could afford to buy homes. Like, it would be easier for them to afford to buy homes. So publicly, this seemed like a good idea, and it actually put a lot of money into the economy. So the economy was booming. People were buying houses. Real estate market was doing well. Everything was fine. The problem is when these loans needed to be paid back eventually, because a lot of these people didn't have the right kind of, let's say, income to carry over whatever they had borrowed. A lot of these loans were going into default, and so what was happening was banks who now owed huge amounts of money to foreign investors, they required a bailout. They were basically in a situation where they needed to pay a tremendous amount of money back. And where was the money going to be found? The only way was through a bailout. And so a similar situation occurred in this case and in 2008, and there was a lot of controversy at that time. So when I was researching what was going on in 2008, I came across this SNL situation that was occurring in the 80s. Like, I guess I had heard about it, but I had not paid, obviously I was a little kid, so I didn't know anything about it really. But there were a couple of interesting facts that, I guess you can't really call them facts. They might fall into the realm of conspiracy, but there were some interesting things that were going on. First of all, I read about a thing called kiting, which basically was these SNL, these companies would purchase a property, and then they would sell that property at a loss to another person, probably a family member or somebody that worked for them, somebody within the company. That person would have another company, like a fake company, just like a name up front, and so that company would own the property, and then they would default on the loan, and the money would never completely circuit through the banking system properly. So just before the loan was due, they would sell the property, and it was like a very strange kind of scheme. It's almost like bouncing checks, basically. But they were doing this with like multi-million-dollar properties. They were doing this with like huge amounts of money, and they were doing it over and over again. And it was just because the banking system at that time, this was during the 80s, couldn't keep up with the scams. So by the time that the loan would come due, or the check would be, was supposed to clear, or whatever it is, they would pull money from one place, put it into the bank. It would take however many days, maybe not 10 days, maybe it would take a month. I don't know how long it was taking in the 80s, but it would take a certain amount of time to clear. And I mean, it was like, I guess it was very similar to money laundering or bouncing checks. Basically, was like, I think the closest example of what kiting was. It's a term called kiting, so you can look that up. But that's what was happening in the SNL industry. There was a tremendous amount of kiting going on, and billions of dollars eventually had gone missing. Now the question is, where did that money go? Because this money was being transferred back and forth on paper, but nobody ever got a hold of this money. And all of these investors, these young, what do you call it? The people, the common people, investors, were losing huge amounts of money. So I guess the conspiracy part of this comes into, they believe that a lot of this money was going into black operations, that we was circulating through the, I think it's the IPF bank. It's a bank in the Middle East. I think it's in Pakistan actually, where Daddy Bush, so not Walker Bush, but George Bush Sr., had the money going into that bank in the Middle East. It was not coming into American books. It was just getting circuited out, and then they were doing whatever various CIA operations. If you're aware, the George Bush Sr. was the head of the CIA at one point, and so apparently always had loyalties to that group, obviously, and was helping to circuit a tremendous amount of money. There were arms deals going on. There was a lot of stuff happening. Even that case of Oliver North, the arms deals that the Iran Contra, it had to do with SNL. I didn't even know that at the time, but he also had a front company, and a front SNL company Oliver North was heading, and that was one of the ways that money was being circuited to various arms deals, how they were paying for these arms from Russia and into Iran, and I don't know exactly how it was working, but it was a very elaborate scheme where money was being just kind of taken out of the country and used in these black operations. The other thing that was happening had to do with the elections, meaning this case didn't come out until after Reagan won his second term. So they also think that even though people knew about it, the scandal didn't break publicly until after the elections, which was, I guess, a key. I don't remember if it was Reagan's or Bush's first term. It had to pass an election. And the SNL scandal, let's see, what year was this? Did it say that it came out? What year? 1989. So I think Bush was elected in 1988. Okay, so it was after his first election. It was after he was elected and fully placed in office. Then the SNL scandal came out. And so that was another part of the conspiracy, that they were making sure that nobody knew about it until after the election, because he might not have been elected if this had become a mainstream story afterwards. But in a way, that kind of happened again 20 years later with the housing loans and what it happened at that after the Clinton laws that had been put in place during Clinton's term. It kind of fell apart in the last part of George W. Bush's term, and part of the conspiracy behind that is right at the end of Bush's term, although he didn't have major scandals or anything like Clinton, there was a lot of animosity towards him for the war and for this major financial story that had come out. Everyone blamed him, even though he had not put those laws into place. It was the previous administration, but that also kind of paved the way for they're thinking a democratic election, the democratic election of Barack Obama, that he was able to slide into place because there was so much animosity towards the Republicans, even though it actually wasn't directly to do with the laws they had put in place. They had done other things that people were upset about, but part of the conspiracy is that it was, the loan scandal and the especially during that era. You know, there was a tremendous amount of control, and it continues to exist in the mainstream media as far as what stories get released and when they get released. There's a little bit of manipulation there. And I guess if there are important elections, they kind of wait till afterwards until something breaks, and in that way they can kind of control the public backlash, or at least it doesn't affect them election-wise. Okay, so that was the savings and loan fiasco. We are still in the financial section, I believe, so we'll read the next financial scandal next time, guys. So that was another installment of Life Magazine's The Most Notorious Scandals in American History. Okay, guys, have a nice night.